Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I am joined from across the pond by our guest, Jean Adshead Grant. I first heard her speak at Humans Under Management, which is a fantastic behavioral finance themed event, if you haven't checked that out. And I was impressed by both her delivery and the unique nature of her subject matter. Jane is a master certified coach with many thousands of hours of one-on-one coaching, largely in financial services. She has worked with an absolute who's who of clients that includes Deloitte, EY, Deutsche Bank, UBS, and many others. Jane, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome, Daniel. It's lovely to be with you once more.
Well, it's great to see you again as well. And many people will be listening to this, but you have behind you a sign that says the listening coach. And you are, among many other things, a listening coach. And you are, I must say, a one of one for me. You are the first that I've met. So what life experiences put you on such a singular path?
Well, I'm thrilled to share that. And thank you for this lovely question. And I would love just to give a shout out and credit to my husband for coming up with the name, the listening coach. In the first instance a few years ago, because he said, Jane, this is who you are. So this would be the name that you could naturally share and have as the title of my book, funnily enough. And it was my daughter's idea to put a sign up in my office just here, which you can see. So thank you for noticing it. So I've been very fortunate to have other people say, this is who you are. But how did I get to be here, I think, was the question that you're asking. And it's such a good question. It requires some thought. And so I've been thinking about it. And what I began to recall that from a very early age in my own life growing up, I really fulfilled the peacemaker role in my family, and many different roles we have. And I just noticed that. And, my parents, went through a divorce, and I spent many an hour listening to them, even as a young child. And of course, at that age, I had no idea really what was going on or what was going on in their life. And yet I was able to listen. And as I grew up and went through school, I witnessed that friends would used to confide in me. And they would also tell me the reason why they would confide in me, the fact that they trusted me not to share what they had felt safe to say. So that struck me. And then as I grew and became a professional and moved into the world of leadership, my team members would say to me, actually, Jane, even before you became a coach, that was your approach to leadership. You're always listening to us and our clients to establish their own solutions and ways forward. And then, of course, after 16 years in the corporate space, and everything from a secretary to an HR leader, I then set up my own company as an independent coach and facilitator. And of course, through that period, I learned the skills of coaching, which one of them is listening, in particular, active listening and reflective listening. But what led me to this, where I am today, Daniel, I'd love to say is, for me, the transformation is when I met Nancy Klein and her work of Time to Think. It was Nancy who awakened me to a type of listening that I hadn't experienced before, a listening which we call generative listening, a listening that helps others become who they're meant to be. And this generative listening transformed my life as a mum, as a daughter, as a business coach, or an executive coach, in the sense it helped deepen and develop my relationships through the nature of my listening. And so it transformed my life in such a positive way that I couldn't keep it for myself. So I went on to write about my experience. I've written a couple of books, as you know, and now I teach this way of being in the world to others and listening workshops. and I help my leadership clients in this space. So I hope that gives you a flavor of why listening is my passion, and it's a vision I imagine where we listen first, helping others step up to and into who they're meant to be. And I do that every day.
Yeah, it was a fantastic explanation. I must admit, I'm feeling a great deal of pressure to be a good listener in this session, but I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you loud and clear. This is off script a bit, Jane, and I hope we'll still be able to get to our questions. But I feel like I have to ask: in what ways did becoming familiar with generative listening change your life? Because it's clear just the reverence with which you talk about it. It clearly had a substantial impact on your life, and I'm curious how it transformed your life.
Yes, thank you. And because it's a very different kind of listening, so it transformed my life in the sense that when we're listening generatively, we're listening to ignite the mind of another, as opposed to listening to reply, to figure out what to say next, to figure out an opinion or a solution. And so it changed my life because it liberated my mind. Listening in this way has enabled me to grow my own capacity to think well, has also developed my wisdom. I've had the capacity to learn from others. And listening in this way has also helped me become more open-minded, and develop a willingness to have my mind changed. These are the reasons it transformed my life. In particular, relationships became stronger. Yeah, just in every which way.
When we're clearly going to get to none of my original questions. When you talk about igniting the mind of others, what would that look like? Because I think that so many of us are listening with an eye to reply. And I think often in listening to reply in a way that will get someone off our case, get the work done in this conversation, make us look good, like not much of it has to do with igniting a fire in someone else, igniting the mind of another person. I'm curious practically what that looks like and what the power of that is.
Yeah, so I would say two things in terms of what it looks like and then what it sounds like. So what it looks like is the listener. How are we showing up as a listener? And so in the work of Nancy Klein, and it was Nancy that discovered this listening to ignite, as a listener, we are demonstrating our listening behaviors through giving our attention, a palpable respect for the human being and what they're saying and what they go on to say, rather than interrupting, finishing their sentences, offering a solution without being asked. It looks like us as a listener being at ease. It looks like us being encouraging. It looks like us appreciating the goodness that we see in front of us. And what it sounds like is us asking open questions, the most profound being, wait for it, so simple, what do you think? Rarely do people get asked that, Daniel. It seems that we're very good at doing other people's thinking for us. And yet people are dying, not only to be heard, they're dying to think for themselves and as themselves. And one way we can tap into that brilliance, that creativity, that courage is by saying, and what do you think about that?
I love a simple multi-purpose tool like that. What do you think about that? One of my earliest, maybe the earliest guests on this podcast was a mentor of mine who was in corporate espionage. And he would get people, I mean, his whole job, he was a Green Beret, he was in the CIA, and then he moved into corporate espionage, and his whole job was to get people to say too much effectively about their employer and their plans and their pricing and sort of all things that would give competitors an advantage. And I asked him, like, how do you draw this stuff out of people? And he said, people think it's so difficult, or it takes so much effort or so much subterfuge or so much complexity. He said, people are so hungry to talk, and no one is ever asking them, what do you think? No one's ever asking, what do you think? And he said, look, all you have to do is take the slightest interest and you're going to learn a lot. And so even, you're doing it in a white hat way. He's perhaps doing it in a black hat way. But, people are dying to speak. People are dying to be heard. Many of our listeners here to the show are financial advisors, and I think it's widely accepted that empathy is a skill that they need to learn, and that it is part of the hallmark of being an effective listener. What role does empathy play, if any, in this process of being a generative listener?
Well, I think that's a great question, and for me, it plays a huge role. In my work, I have discovered 5 levels of listening, beginning with, listening to self. We need to be good at listening to ourselves in order to be great listeners for others. And then move through the levels of pretend listening. And many of our listeners, I'm sure, will be used to this, having been in the presence of someone who's simply pretending to listen. They're doing all the right things, but their mind is elsewhere. Then we have factual listening to the facts, getting the details to help us discern what to do next or make a decision. Then we have empathetic listening, which is listening to the facts and the feelings, being aware of the non-body language, being aware of the non-verbals. And the reason why empathetic listening for me is so significant and important is its impact. Because when we listen with empathy to both the facts and the feelings, other people feel seen, heard, and understood. And not just for what they're doing or saying, but who they are being as a human being. And so for me, empathy is a huge part of listening deeply and generative listening, which for me is the ultimate level, listening to ignite the mind of another, having had that connection through empathy. So the other purpose for me of developing our empathetic listening is it's the foundation of compassion. As we develop as leaders in today's society, more than ever, compassionate leadership is what makes the difference. It grows our people that will then grow our business. So as a financial services specialist, a financial planning business, being empathetic towards our clients and our team members, understanding who they are, understanding their gifts and talents, understanding their aspirations, and creating an environment for them to be their best self, and then to help our clients in that same way, will have a huge impact.
This will be timely. This episode will be coming out either right before or right after an episode I just did on compassion, an entire episode on compassion, where the researcher, Dr. Derek Greiner, referred to compassion as empathy in action. So that's a beautiful, beautiful segue. Can you go through the 5? Can you go through the 5 just very briefly and talk about those 5 levels again? I know you started to touch on that.
Yeah, sure. So I start with self-listening because I think it's critical, and we often overlook the impact of listening full stop, yet alone our own listening. So self-listening is essentially what we do when we're in the shower or out for a walk or wherever we might be. And it's those internal thoughts that will be going through our head. And my invitation is to take a pause in your day at any time just to connect with yourself and ask yourself some questions and begin to listen to yourself. What do I want? What do I want to accomplish today? What might be getting in the way of me being the best person I can today? And listening to ourselves, the key thing is to listen with compassion. Here comes that word again, rather than in combat. Sometimes we'll fall into the trap of beating ourselves up. Something didn't go so well. We then might review our performance and say, you didn't do this, you should have done that. Rather that a more compassionate mind might say, well, you had that opportunity, what did you learn from that? So learning to listen to yourself is critical. The next level is pretend listening. And this is not a level, Daniel, as you know, that I advocate, but I share it because I think it's critical to appreciate that in any one conversation, in any moment of our day, we all can fall into the trap of pretend listening. We've got these distractions that are constantly peppering our life, whether it's pings or dings from the phone or the laptop or somebody walking in or a barista asking us what we want. So we're constantly interrupted. And we might, we do often interrupt ourselves. Our mind goes blank, or in fact, rather, the mind goes off on a different tangent while we're listening to another. So being aware that we might do this is to then call ourselves back in in line and give our attention once more to the speaker. The next level is factual listening. This is where we're listening to the facts, finding out more data, finding out the information that might be missing in order for us to make a decision, discern what to do next. Is this a moment to coach my team member? Is this a moment to mentor them? Is this a moment to collaborate with them? I won't know until I've got the information. Then we have our empathetic listening, as I mentioned, listening to both the facts and the feelings. And sometimes the feelings will be visible and others they won't. And listening to feelings, the empathetic listening is also, to get our mindset into this, is to consider the fact that as human beings, we all have a unique perspective of the world. That perspective comes from our education, where we're born, the language we speak, what we've been exposed to in our business life, our culture. And therefore, we'll all have our own views on a situation or worldviews. And to be an empathetic listener is to say, I'm looking at it through my perspective. What if I sat in Daniel's seat and looked at it through his lens, his perspective? That is somebody who is demonstrating and willing to be empathetic. Considering the perspective of another. And finally, generative listening. Generative listening is what I would call as a listening to ignite. And this is Nancy Klein's work of Time to Think. Listening to ignite the mind in another. And when I say ignite the mind, what I mean by that, Daniel, is igniting the finest independent thinking in the human being we have the privilege of conversing with. And so we're not listening for anything. We are listening with another. We are listening with a palpable respect for who the person is. We are listening, most importantly, free of any interruption. We will not interrupt them. We are listening free of judgment. We are interested in who they are, what they go on to say, with a sense of awe and wonder almost, fascination, rather than listening to reply, make a diagnosis, come up with a solution, or generate an opinion. So this is generative listening, listening to ignite the finest thinking in another. Those are the 5 levels.
This 5-level model is just so powerful, right? I look at it and it immediately speaks to me. I can think of times where I've been in one level or another. I assume that we spend most of our time in either the pretend or the factual listening. Is that where we spend most of our days?
Well, what do you think?
Oh no, she got me. I do think that's where we spend. I do think that's where we spend most of our time. And it strikes me that even that's probably not always a bad thing. I mean, many of our listening interactions are somewhat transactional. You mentioned the barista. Not to say that you could never have a genuine human, deeper moment with someone you're having a casual interaction with. I certainly have, and those have been meaningful from time to time. But sometimes there's a line, you're just trying to get your coffee, and maybe, factual listening is what's called for.
I think so. I think it's a good call. I mean, again, we're seeing increasingly through the research, and fascinating to listen to your other guest around his work on compassion, how, in my experience in talking with other fellow listeners, we see and hear that people are dying to be listened to more than anything. It's right up there with love. Right up there. And even today, I've just come from a coaching session with one of my clients, a senior leader in the City of London. And, I was saying to her, what do you need from your sponsor? And she said, well, Jane, quite frankly, I want him simply to listen to me. And we're talking at the senior exec level of an organization. And you'd think, well, that's a straightforward ask. But it's such a shame that at this level, all levels, people don't feel listened to. And that's what they want. So I think we're seeing a greater movement towards empathetic listening. We're seeing lots of research around empathy and the impact it has on team members and organizations and levels of engagement. I think generative listening is a stretch. And I say that because in my experience of being a generative listener and teaching it to others, it requires a radical discipline and it requires courage. Huge courage to listen to people in this way, resisting the urge to interrupt, resisting the urge to place an opinion, resisting the urge to offer a solution when it's not been asked.
It strikes me that there is perhaps a meaningful interplay between speaking and listening, though? Because when I think about something like empathy or generative listening, as I understand it from our brief conversation, it strikes me that my response is material in furthering or hindering the depth of that conversation, whether it sort of remains at that pretend or factual level, or whether it deepens into the empathetic or generative space. And it also will go back to the barista. I mean, I think that's an easy conversation to think about, but even in work, so many of our conversations, AI could write them, right? I mean, it's rote, it's predictable, it's functional. What tips do you have for breaking out of that dance of sort of rote responding, and what sort of tips do you have for the type of responses that further us into that empathetic or generative listening?
Well, you may recall, I think I shared this, I developed a mnemonic that is easy to use and easy to remember, and for that very purpose. And so it's called EARS. And so I think as anyone who's wanting to deepen their listening skills such that they can have a greater impact on the lives of others, is the E stands for eye contact. So in our culture, certainly in the West, eye contact is around a way to show that you are attending to them. So in essence, giving a soft eye contact rather than a hard gaze is around giving your attention, free from any distraction and interruption. So the E is for eye contact. A is to discover and learn the way of asking questions. And one way to become a really good listener is to develop the art of asking open questions. Open questions are those that do not require a yes or no answer. And these are the questions that will take us from to empathy to generative listening. Factual listening, you might have a closed question because you want the information. But to get to emotional, so to get to empathy and generative, the art of open-ended questions most often start with a what. And Laura Berman-Fortgan, who's a wonderful coach and she's written some fabulous books, came up with a concept of wisdom accessing questions, WAQ, W-A-Q. A WAQ question is a short, specific question, always starts with what. What do you want to accomplish? What might be stopping you? What have you considered so far? What are your options now? What did you learn from that? These are the kind of questions that really help people to think and keep on thinking well. So the A is for ask questions. R is resist the urge to interrupt. We live in a world that's peppered with interruptions. We interrupt ourselves after 8 seconds. We get bored with what we're doing, and then we'll go and open up another window. We'll have a quick look on Instagram. So resist the urge to interrupt yourself, but also others. Again, it will be, I think the research now says 8 seconds before somebody will interrupt, even if we're in mid-flow conversation. So resist that urge to interrupt. And the S stands for silence. Get comfortable with the silence. So often we rush to fill that. And what might seem forever to us as the listener, for the speaker, they crave that time, that pause, that they are just getting what they want to say in a way that they can then share it with you in an articulate way. So we need to hold the space and give them that space. So E is hold eye contact to show your attention, ask open-ended questions, open questions, resist the urge to interrupt, and get comfortable with silence. I would offer as one great step to deepening your listening skills.
The SPY-PART model and the EARS, this sort of mental lattice work of EARS, I mean, we won't stop, but we could stop right there. And I think you could spend a lifetime just sort of applying those two things. You met my son, Liam, at the conference. In the UK, Liam became addicted to crunchy bars. We packed in, and I mean, he had like, I'm not exaggerating. The young man had like half of his carry-on bag filled with Cadbury chocolate on the way home. He really fell in love. So I took him to a sort of a high-end candy shop here in Atlanta that sells British candy. It's not something you can find just anywhere. I took him to this shop. It's quite expensive. It was sort of a special treat. And we go to check out, and the person working at the checkout had headphones in and took one headphone out and, rung us up and then put their headphone back in. And it was so jarring and so disrespectful to me, right? I mean, I was just like, goodness gracious, you can't spare 30 seconds to exchange some pleasantries. And then I think all of us have also had those conversations on the other end where all of these ears framework were in place, right? There was that eye contact, there was that connection, there was appropriate use of silence, which was perhaps my biggest learning as a budding psychotherapist, was learning not to fill every space and how much value can come from a pregnant pause. So this is an absolutely invaluable framework. A question here as we begin to move to another area of your expertise. Why do you think it is? We've perhaps heard from our parents that, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth and we should be better at listening. And we have these sort of wives' tales about this. But there's so many resources for someone hoping to become a better speaker. There's Toastmasters, there's books like Talk Like TED. I mean, that would be a very typical part of an executive, sort of an executive coaching and executive education program. And yet here you are, the one and only listening coach I've ever met in my life. Why is it that, the communication piece, the speaking piece gets so much shine and listening is so roundly ignored?
Well, I think the answer's simple. We get rewarded for speaking up. We get rewarded for speaking, for him not speaking up, but for speaking more than we do listening. When we think about the performance appraisals of people, how often do you get rated an A for listening to your team members? So I think, and we get to see it play out. So we think about team meetings where most often we'll see 70% of the contributions are made by the same 30% of people. Those with the loudest voice, those who want to have their voice heard. And what happens is that they drown out the quiet ones, the wise ones, the thoughtful ones. And the quiet ones then get spoken over, or worse still, not given the opportunity to contribute. And so I think the simple reason is that we get rewarded for being a great speaker, a public speaker. And the listening piece is something that is innate, that we all have the capacity to listen, and yet we overlook the impact we can have when we truly choose to listen. Because I think you've got the sort of passive listening, sort of hearing, and then you've got this kind of active listening, and then generative listening. And the last thing that's just come to my mind as you asked me this question is it takes courage to listen. Some people are frightened to ask the question because they don't want to hear the answer. Or worse still, bless you, they worry that they don't know how to respond. So perhaps those, I think, are the 3 key reasons why listening is underrated and it's not rewarded in contrast to speaking.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and maybe it's a call organizationally for us to start caring about listening and measuring and coaching on listening as much as we coach on speaking and participation, and making sure that every voice is represented as well. I think what you said was very wise, because you said, look, we can, most of us can hear, right? But hearing and listening are very different things. My wife is a visual artist, and I can see, but when I'm with her and I'm walking in nature or at an art gallery or something, the lens through which she takes in the world is so different and so superior to sort of the way that I move through the world, because she's attentive to the smallest details. And so there's seeing and then there's seeing, right? And then there's hearing and then there's listening. So that's why I think this work is so powerful. Jane, one of the things that I really liked that you said when I asked you about how your own life had been transformed by this work, you said, now I'm going to expose myself as a bad listener. You said something to the effect of it allowed you to change your mind, right? It allowed you to think about things, to not always have to be right, to disagree sort of fruitfully, and to change your mind. If I'm outing myself here, one of the things that I have a hard time doing, these next two questions are about things I struggle with. I have a hard time listening to people with whom I disagree. And I find myself becoming like an attorney, or almost preparing a defense or a rebuttal rather than listening and trying to have my mind changed. And that's not who I want to be. What tips and tricks do you have for listening deeply to someone with whom you perhaps share very little in terms of your worldview?
Again, Daniel, I think this is such a fabulous question because it's so real and it's so relevant right now, but in both sides of our pond, from every aspect of society. And funnily enough, it's a question that I'm working on right now. How do I help other people listen when it's tough to do so? Listen when you don't want to. Listen when it's difficult, i.e. when you have a very different or opposing view. We live in a world that's increasingly having polarity of views. So this is why I love the question. And a few things come to mind. So how do we get to listen to somebody with a very different view? Well, the first is we make the choice. Like, we have to decide we're going to do this. Okay, it might be tough, but I'm going to do it. The second thing is to just take a moment to be aware of our own biases. So some of these will be conscious and some of them unconscious, but just know that we'll all have a bias and a thought or an opinion on a topic or something. So just know that. So this is developing our own self-awareness as we even enter into the conversation. The next thing I do is I'd say, and funnily enough, I've got this in my book and my card deck. I've got a card deck, the listening deck, and I share in there some of the biases of listening, i.e. what stops us listening, anything from the opinionator to the grouch. And then a list of principles, 7 principles for listening to overcome these biases and barriers. And one of them is to develop an open mindset. And this idea, as you've just shared, Daniel, is to be willing to have your mind changed. So I have my thought and idea and position on this topic. I'm interested to learn about yours. And I'm also open to whether I have my mind changed. My husband and I had a conversation just last night about our young 20-year-old girls and, how do we support them once they finish full-time education? Ed had a view, I had a view, and they were different. And I was interested to learn. I was thinking, okay, well, let me understand more of yours. And he was interested to learn where I was coming from. And I was open to have my mind changed, and as he was. And we both, came together and said, okay, we both agreed. Now we know. So this is the conversation we can have with them at the appropriate time. And it was all funding, sort of to do with, how do we help them financially from students as to they get to the next piece. And so here's a chance where we had differing views, but both open and willing to have our mind changed. So that's the next thing to do, in my experience. And I think the final step is to recognize that we don't have to agree with another person, and yet we can acknowledge them for who they are. So the fact that we have differing perspectives or different ideas and opinions on this topic, it doesn't mean I think any less of you. Rather, I can accept you for who you are and the fact you have that view, and I don't agree. And it's okay to not agree. It's okay to not agree. So I think it's that, being willing to know that I can acknowledge you for who you are, and I don't have to agree with what you say.
Yeah. Really sound advice for an election year. I think it's an election year. What did I hear the other day? It's an election year, I think, in almost 70% of the world or something. 70% of the world's population is going to the polls this year. And there's a lot of tumult that can come with that, and a lot of bad blood. And I think if we follow Jane's advice here, we'll be better off. This listeners of this show will know that I use the experts that I have on here for free therapy. So that's where we're going next. We've been corresponding on LinkedIn for the last little bit since I met you late last year at Humans Under Management. And one of the things that you did that I found very kind and endearing was you inquired after my son by name. Now, if I had met your children, I promise you, I would have immediately forgotten their names. What I do is I remember everything about a person. I would remember where they're from, what they do, their favorite color, what they like to eat. I have if I do say so, I have a remarkable memory for the facts of a person's life. And I seem to have a horrific memory for names. And it's embarrassing to me, because it makes me feel, I think it makes people feel like I'm too good, or I didn't care, or I didn't listen. And perhaps some of that's true. I mean, I guess I didn't listen. I didn't remember their name. I think this is a common problem, though. Saying someone's name back to them, remembering the name of their child, this is such an endearing trait. This is such a generous and a kind thing. For people like me who struggle with this, how can we be better?
Well, I love this question too. Thank you. I think the first step is you're already there, that you know it's something that you want to develop. And Daniel, the other thing is you know what it feels like when people use your name. So taking a moment just to think and reflect about the impact when somebody uses your name, or even in this case, Liam's name, how that made you feel. So for me, taking effort, because it does require effort, as you said, to find out the name and then remember it, says to them, you matter. And saying it through the conversation, because rarely do we hear our name, but when we do, it makes us feel whole, like that I'm a person here. So a few things I'd say is, first of all, thinking about why is it important to you? The impact of saying somebody's name is huge for them. It makes them feel they really matter. Secondly, when we're given a lot of information from somebody, we're never going to remember it all. So if you have forgotten the name, don't worry about asking again. Say, oh, Daniel, I know we've only just met a day ago, but you had your lovely son. Remind me his name is, Liam. Yes. Okay, Liam. So always ask for it again, or even, I've had a complete mental block. Your name is Daniel. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So find it out again if you've forgotten. So don't beat yourself up, and then use it often in the conversation. And the beginning of the conversation, as you said, repeat it back a few times. It gets lodged in your mind. The last thing I say, this is a tip for any memory, and I'm no expert in this, but I know other your listeners may well have come across this, is for some people is to make a visual of that name or that place, or a rhyme, so what does that name remind me of, or what does it rhyme with, such that that's a little memory tool that you could use. But in essence, I think understand the purpose of why you want to remember the name, the impact it has. Don't be afraid of asking for it afresh and saying it back 2 or 3 times to remember it.
Yeah, that's all great advice. One of my words, I had 3 words going into the new year that I kind of wanted to define my new year. And one of them was community. And this is a small thing, but I work out in the mornings before I drop my daughter off at school. I at a Bible study before school. I go work out every morning, and there's probably 15 or 20 people I see at the gym every morning, none of whom I have ever exchanged any kind of pleasantry with or spoken to at all. And I'm like, this is weird. I see the same 15 people every day, and we can't wave at each other. And so this year I've been working on community. I've met 3 or 4 gentlemen at the gym now and said hi to them and exchanged tips and things like this. And every time they come in, I have to remind myself, I'm like, okay, that's Craig. And I'm so bad at this, but the repetition, I'm getting there. So I think it is about caring. It's about using those mnemonics. It's about repeating, tying it to something visual. And again, I like what you said about just not even, sort of humbly being afraid to ask again, like, hey, my bad. I want to remember this. So what is it? I like that. Okay. Last question before I give you a chance to tell us where we can find out more about your wonderful work. You're a thinking coach. And this is so awesome to me. A few years back, I spent a summer in Canada. Shout out to ATB, who hired me for a summer to come to Canada. And when we were going through our work together, we had about a 3 or 4 month engagement. They said, we want to make sure you're not overscheduled, because we've hired you for your mind, and your mind needs time to think. And I thought this was so unusual, so right on, and especially on a limited engagement. I mean, there was a real, they were paying me well. It was a short engagement. There could have been a real impulse to just kind of wring every moment out of me and say, hey, we want you back to back for 3 months. They didn't do that. The majority of us, right? Certainly everyone probably listening to this podcast works in a thought leadership role. We're all knowledge workers now. And yet carving out time to think feels frivolous, or it feels like not real work. Can you help us overcome that paradox and that divide and think about how we can get more thinking time at work?
Yes. And so just to clarify what we mean by that. So the nature of my work in my executive coaching practice is I bring this beautiful work from Nancy Klein. It's called a thinking environment. And so what I do for my clients is to generate an environment for them to bring their finest independent thinking in the time we have. So I create the time. So how do we do this? Well, and my clients have back-to-back meetings. In fact, the client I referred to earlier this morning, she said, I've just realized I just need to slow down, Jane, because I'm good when I slow down. I've had to tell my diary coordinator to stop putting in back-to-back meetings. And so people are beginning to become aware of it. And it is a paradox, because in the work that I do with clients, I have them for an hour and a half once a month, and they'll say to me, Jane, this is the most valuable time in my whole month. It's the first time that I truly sat down and thought about what I want to accomplish on this, that, or t'other. And the time to think the paradox is, when you slow down and you're asked thoughtful questions to ignite your own thinking, in an environment that says you matter, you'll become more creative, courageous, and confident, and accomplish breakthroughs that you hadn't. The challenge we have in today's world, Daniel, is we live in a world of what we call exchange thinking. Exchange thinking is characterized by urgency. It's what we already know. The knowledge we share is stuff we already know. It is popularized by conversation, by consulting, and a listening to reply. I'll listen to you just enough before I get the gist, and boom, I'm interrupting and I'm offering a solution. Whereas what I do is work at the other end of the spectrum, generating an environment for independent thinking. It's sparsely populated. It's the world of the unknown, unknowable. And it's a listening to ignite that helps people break through to their newest, freshest thinking. So how do we do this? I invite our listeners to give yourself 5 minutes out in a day, just like I did on that, on the keynote or the speech that we were at together. I got the whole audience to just be quiet for 2 minutes and think. Just give yourself the space to listen to yourself while you think. So I would say, give yourself 5 minutes in a day and use this time to reflect. Use this time for thinking. Better still, work with a coach to say, I want you to give me this time. Please listen to me in a way that I can think as and for myself. If you want to know more, check me out or have a look at the Time to Think website to discover more. I could talk for ages on this, but I'm very conscious of your time.
Yes, thank you. Well, Jane, in closing, this has been phenomenal. Every now and then you become aware of something like your work that is so critical and so needed, and I didn't even know it existed 3 months ago. So this is a real treat for me. So thank you. If listeners want to learn more about your books, your tools, your coaching, where can we learn more about you and support the good work that you're doing?
Thank you for inviting me to share. Simply my website, I have two, but if you go to thelisteningcoach.co.uk, you can find out about everything there that I offer. And if you want a copy of my latest book, The Listening Coach, The Critical Skills of Listening for Your Life, Business and Community, they're available on Amazon and also LinkedIn. So I'm often on LinkedIn, so people can find me just under my name, Jean Adshead Grant.
Okay, Jane, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Incredible time today. Thank you again.
You're so welcome. It's been lovely to be with you.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.